This video is an educational video backed by sources and direct references at the bottom of the screen, which means that it is allowed under YouTube's community guidelines. However, because YouTube doesn't stick to its own guidelines and changes them quite often, I'm going to play it safe. I will not be using certain words and will be replacing them with others. I will not be going too specific with any of the accounts, even though I could, and I'm going to be offering you a chance to click off the video right now if you are of a sensitive nature. I mean, I do wonder why you'd click on the video in the first place if you were of a sensitive nature, but that's another story. So, a while ago I got a question from one of my patrons, which is quite a provocative question. I'm going to read it in full because he's not the only person I've seen who has this view, and then I'll address it afterwards. So, Schwarzer says, at Tick, after watching your video, Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, the Soviet and German economies and more, Tick Q&A 3, I was surprised to learn that you stated that the Soviet Union's crimes pale in comparison to the German. No doubt, the Nazi efforts in those 6 calendar years were some of the worst to stand on this earth, especially in our modern day. Yet, the crimes of the Soviet Union and the Japanese include in it a crime that, in personal belief, ought to be taken more earnestly: mass R. From Nemmersdorf to Berlin, the Soviet army R-ed millions of women en masse. I often receive the counter when I bring up this fact that R is but a part of war, and the Germans did it too. I then proceed to claim that individual R is massively different from mass R. After this, many often say that I am trying to downplay German atrocities and accuse me of being a Wehraboo. I see this as unfounded, and it seems to me that many are way too comfortable to ignore the mass R that the Soviets committed not only to German women, yet also to Hungarian, Finnish, Polish, and to a lesser extent Baltic and Ukrainian women. Am I being unfair and unfounded? And what is your opinion on the subject of the Soviet and Japanese mass R, as well as R in general in the Second World War? P.S. I do indeed realise it is a heavy topic, but all aspects of the war must be covered in personal belief, for it is central to looking back on the war of blame, the European calamity. First things first, you presented the idea that the Germans didn't commit mass R in the Second World War. You are then jumping to the conclusion that the noble Germans weren't as bad as the Soviets or Japanese. This is a common belief because the Germans made a big deal about Soviet crimes, especially in Nemmersdorf and Berlin. What you've not seen is the other side of the coin. One of the highest estimates I've seen is that about 1.4 to 1.9 million German women were R-ed by mostly Red Army soldiers in the Second World War. The same source notes that because of repeated gang Rs, the total number of Rs was even higher. Okay. But do you want to know how many women were R-ed by the German army on the Eastern Front alone? 10 million. So, in terms of scale, I think it's fair to say that the Wehrmacht committed more crimes against women than the Red Army did. That's why I said that the crimes pale in comparison, because they do. In fact, we have several different categories here for how the Germans treated women. We have individual R, gang R, which the Germans did do. We have women forced to sell their bodies independently or informally in order to survive. Women forced to sell their bodies formally in order to survive. And women forcefully enslaved within a formal state R system. Yes, the National Socialists socialised the means of reproduction into a centrally planned R system. That's something even the Soviets didn't do. There's a source, it's the main one I'm using because it's the best, called Victims, Heroes and Survivors, which you can find online for free as a PDF. I'd recommend that you read it if you want to hear accounts of some of the crimes against women. I'm not going to repeat them here because I'm sure ThemTube won't be happy. Instead, I'm going to give you an overview of what happened so that you can get the overall picture. First off, because historians have taken a rather simplistic view of Nazi ideology, they just assumed that there wouldn't be any intercourse between Aryans and inferior races due to the racial defilement laws. This view is incorrect. The German soldiers had forced intercourse with so-called inferior races. So historians have got things wrong again. Now, you might be asking yourself, why haven't I heard about these crimes before? Well, we now know the reason. The S crimes committed primarily against women and girls by Germans and Soviets during World War II were not included in investigations of war crimes, and neither side has ever taken responsibility for their serious crimes against humanity in the form of gender violence. The omission of S violence came about in part because former German soldiers complained to their government, which subsequently filed a protest with the UN Sub-Commission. But ignoring it doesn't get around the fact that the Germans did commit mass R on the Eastern Front. They also stole food and clothing from the local populace, forcing them to starve. Almost all of the people I interviewed in the Cherkasy region of Ukraine told me about how the Germans stole all their food. Many still cried about this, and it was very apparent that they had suffered tremendously because of this lack of sustenance. I've mentioned this before, so I won't go into any details, like I did in my Greek video, about how lockups cause mass starvation, but what I will do is explain that because of the deliberate starvation policy implemented by the Wehrmacht and the German High Command, many women in Greece, but also in the East and other places, were forced to sell themselves to the Germans in exchange for the food they'd already had stolen from them. Because of the extreme deprivation the Germans imposed on people throughout the Reich, but especially in the camps in the occupied East, countless women and girls were desperate enough to go pro in an attempt to stay alive. Independent or unregulated professionalism flourished under the German occupation. The result was widespread intercourse-transmitted diseases noted by German doctors, who then tried to find the source, i.e. the women, who were spreading the diseases. In one case, a German drew a map to where he had had relations with a woman in a wood near Riga, and this map is preserved in the historical record. It may be argued that these women did this voluntarily, and so it shouldn't be seen as assault. This is a grey area, and there's an argument to be had that some of the women did, in fact, fall in love with their German conquerors. There's also a concept called war brides, where women would submit themselves to their new conquerors due to the fact that it was their best survival strategy. Since their old lovers and children were killed and they were enslaved, it made sense to get over the old and get on with the new. But it could also be argued, at least in terms of the Eastern Front, that the starvation and deprivation caused by the Germans compelled women to embrace their new conquerors. So even though it wasn't direct assault in the cases where they volunteered, it was an indirect assault because they were still forced into doing it by the conditions created by the conquerors. If the Germans hadn't killed many of the men and hadn't forced starvation upon the women, then would they have been so willing to have these relations with the Germans? I'd argue not. Indeed, if a woman could only see one method as a way to avoid starvation, finding a S partner, this is most certainly a form of S slavery. That women took such steps, however, highlights their agency and ability to use resources available to them, sometimes including their bodies, to try to survive or save their families. But because of all this unregulated intercourse, be it consensual or not, there was widespread diseases, and this issue became a big problem. In fact, it was such an issue that it went all the way to the top, as high as Hitler and Himmler. In November 1942, Hitler ordered that immediate measures be taken to fight a further increase of intercourse-transmitted diseases, including the procurement of male contraception. They tried educating the soldiers about these diseases, they tried to sanitize them, and they tried to find the source of the infection, aka the women spreading the disease. But since none of this worked, the Germans decided to create a centrally planned brothel system where they enslaved women and could get rid of the women when they discovered that they were spreading diseases.
As we have seen, venereal disease was widespread among both the military and civilian populations, and in their attempt to control these diseases, the German state established state-run brothels for the Wehrmacht, SS, and other members of the German military. The primary reason behind establishing military brothels, that was expressed by the Germans, was the preservation of the German race. Aryan soldiers and officers were to stay healthy and active. Women and girls in the East were forced into such fates because of the lack of food due to the German invasion, subsequent occupation, and deliberate policy of starvation. Other women and girls were forced into this kind of work at gunpoint. Still others were given the so-called choice of living and dying in a concentration camp or working in a brothel. Regardless of how they entered the system, women and girls endured repetitive assaults on their bodies by men who came to the German brothels each day.
In one brothel in Poland, the girls received 6 to 12 visitors per day. One was popular and got 32, and the men were limited to 10 minutes with the girls due to their high demand. The duty sergeant would simply yell, "Next." And this wasn't the only case either. There have been 569 military brothels identified throughout the Reich, West and East, in which at least 50,000 women were caught within their confines, although this number is a conservative guesstimate and is probably much, much higher. Here is a photograph of a military brothel in France in what is an ex-synagogue. This picture was taken in 1940, and it's not clear if the women inside were volunteers or not. I really recommend that you read the source Victims, Heroes, Survivors, because I think I've pressed the boundaries of what I can say in a YouTube video. So let me just wheel back to the original question. Schwarzer made the case that the Germans didn't commit mass R on the Eastern Front. I think the evidence shows that this view is simply wrong. The Germans definitely did. He then says that he gets accused of downplaying the German atrocities and actually puts the words German atrocities in quotation marks, which suggests that he doesn't believe that these German atrocities happened. He then gets accused of being a wehraboo. What I would say, Schwarzer, is that you didn't know. You only heard about the Soviet atrocities and you didn't know about the German atrocities. And that's understandable because of the Cold War, the bias of both Western and Soviet historians to ignore this issue for various reasons, the fact that it's a sensitive subject, and so on. But now you do know. Now you need to stop believing that the Germans didn't commit these crimes because they did. Or that the Germans didn't commit many crimes, or the type of crimes that the Soviets did, because they did. And if you keep pushing the idea that they didn't, then yes, you're taking sides and you need to stop it. And I know people will push back on me today and say that I'm downplaying the Soviet atrocities. No, I'm not. I told you how many German women were victims at the beginning. 2 million at the most. I've read Beaver's Berlin. It was one of the first history books I ever read. I've read others as well, which speak of the Soviet atrocities, and I'm not downplaying them. What they did was wrong. Yes, Marxists will point out that the Germans did it first, therefore the Soviets were responding, but I disagree. Just because the state is stealing my money through the power of taxation and inflation doesn't mean that I'm justified in becoming a thief. You don't stoop down to the level of criminals, so I don't think the Soviets were justified either. But what we have here are people taking sides with one disgusting regime over the other disgusting regime. Well, you need to stop it. Don't take sides. Yes, the scale of the atrocities may skew to the German side, but the Soviets committed the same horrible acts as the Germans did. The point is that both sides are bad. Both regimes were evil, and I go so far as to say that all regimes are evil. So stop defending your tribes, stop defending your regimes, and start thinking for yourself. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.